Hello and welcome back to the Age of Scotland Institute student-led podcast series. My name is Eleanor Channer. I'm an intern at the ASI, and I'm joined here today by Jeremy Grant to discuss offshore wind, Asian finance, and Scottish renewables. Jeremy is a freelance columnist for the Scotsman and former senior editor at PwC, with 23 years experience working as a journalist at the Financial Times, covering Vietnam and Singapore and Malaysia as part of a career that's included 6 years in the US. Welcome, Jeremy. Thank you for joining us today.
Eleanor, great to be here. Thank you for asking me.
Excellent. Well, let's dive in. There's been a lot of discussion surrounding Scotland's offshore wind sector. Could you start us off by giving us a bit of background as to what offshore wind is, in particular, what floating offshore wind is, and how it differs from the other type of offshore wind, which is the fixed bottom model? What advantages does it offer over fixed bottom wind?
Yeah, for anyone who's new to the world of offshore of wind power, um, there are, as you alluded to, two types really of wind power. One is wind power that's derived from wind turbines which sit on land, hence onshore wind. And then, of course, there are the wind turbines which sit on the ocean or sometimes stuck into the seabed in the ocean, and that gets to the fixed bottom and floating bit that you just alluded to. So Scotland already has quite a lot of onshore wind, uh, and that's growing. But on the offshore side, that's something which really started kicking off about 2010, 2011, when the former First Minister Alex Salmond declared that Scotland wanted Scotland to be, quote, the Saudi Arabia of wind. And some of your listeners may remember that a certain British Prime Minister, Boris Johnson, made a great play on the UK needing to become the Saudi Arabia of wind. It was actually a phrase which was come up that was produced by Alex Salmond earlier, and it shows that the ambition for offshore wind in Scotland goes back quite a way. And I think it's fair to say that it's fairly obvious why Scotland, because if you look off the coast of Aberdeenshire into the North Sea, it's pretty windy. And that is regarded as an asset of Scotland and of the UK. Although I suspect that the Scottish National Party would regard it under their nationalist agenda as a Scottish asset purely. That's something which obviously can be debated, but it is, in any case, it's a UK asset. We have a lot of wind off the coast of Scotland, and that makes it therefore a logical place to harness the wind for the purpose of generating electricity for power, for renewable energy. And so at the moment, what we're looking at in Scotland is almost the second phase, I would say, of a big effort, which started in 2010, 2011, with the building of some offshore wind farms, not many, just some. We now are in a second phase, which started in 2022, with the award of some seabed options to develop wind farms at scale in a project known as ScotWind. ScotWind is basically a project made up of 20 consortia that want to build wind farms, and were awarded options that can eventually convert to leases. When I say leases, I mean a lease which has been granted by Crown Estate Scotland, which controls the seabed around Scotland, in the same way that Crown Estate in England controls the seabed around England. Crown Estate Scotland does that. And they are the ones who granted the options that can be eventually converted into leases that developers of these wind farms can then have to operate these wind farms. So where we're at now is we're now 3 years on from the ScotWind leasing round, so-called. There are 20 consortia that are hoping to build wind farms in the North Sea. Some of these are massive. And just to give you an idea, one of them called Ossian envisages about 265 turbines, which each of them would be almost as tall as the Eiffel Tower. I mean, this is on a Promethean scale, what is being envisaged here. So, and why is this happening? Well, clearly we are on a push towards renewable energy, and rightly so, because we have a climate crisis and we need renewable energy. We also need to drive towards renewables because we cannot rely forever on North Sea oil and gas. That is a diminishing asset. It's not gone, and I would personally argue that it should continue to be explored, but we must push, towards renewables. And I think the ambition for offshore wind fits into that very clearly. So hopefully that explains the. I haven't actually dealt with your question around fixed versus floating. So very quickly, I'll deal with that. Fixed bottom, I alluded to that at the beginning, is where you have a wind turbine that's basically stuck into the seabed, drilled in, and it sits there on the seabed. And you have the blade whirring away on top. That's quite common and has been around for a while. What's new technology is floating wind, meaning that you have some kind of platform which you sit on the top of the sea surface, and a turbine is erected on top of that. And this thing that floats on the top is anchored by big cables that go down to the seabed and are literally anchored into the seabed. That's the most common way of doing it. And this is quite new technology and has not been done at scale anywhere in the world, really. Certainly not at a commercial level. 60% of ScotWind is for floating, and that's quite critical.
Okay, and so why has offshore wind become such a big sector since 2022 specifically? You mentioned ScotWind and the need for renewable energy with the sort of gradual phasing out of North Sea oil, but this must have significant potential for sustainable employment too. What are the other reasons for this really driving forward since 2022?
Well, I think it's fair to say that since 2020, let's say 2020, shall we say, post-COVID, there's been a real push on renewables generally, globally, for all the reasons that I think most of your listeners would already know, given the imperative of the move to deal with the climate crisis and to switch our systems towards an electrified system for industry, for households, or whatever else. And offshore wind is seen as an increasingly important component of that. I mean, you've seen a lot of offshore wind development quite recently in Europe. So France, for example, Portugal is quite windy. Anybody who's been to Portugal will know the southwest coast is very windy. You see a lot of people surfing down there because it's windy. So Portugal has plans. Poland as well. Even tiny Malta last year, or was it this year? I can't remember, started developing plans for how it was going to grapple with offshore wind because it obviously sees potential in the waters around Malta. So it's really taken off. It's also taken off in Asia. And you see countries in Asia really developing offshore wind, Australia, Japan, and Vietnam, actually, in particular. Interestingly, there was a delegation from Vietnam that came to Edinburgh about 3 or 4 months ago, specifically coming to look at and learn from the Scottish experience in offshore wind. And there are a lot of these delegations coming from around the world because Scotland is a world leader in this. And other countries are looking to learn from the Scottish playbook to see what is happening. I should mention, of course, the US, where there has been an enormous amount done in offshore wind. But of course, as many of your listeners will now know, President Trump has killed that off. I'm not even going to say he's attempted to kill it off. He really has killed it off. And as the project financing for offshore wind in the US has completely dried up because they see it's basically a dead end at this point, which has implications for Europe, I think, because I think you will see some investment coming this way instead. That we can perhaps discuss another time. But anyway, that's the reason why offshore wind is where we're at with it, why it is such a big thing now. Although I will say, the International Renewable Energy Agency this week, and we're recording this in mid-October, just came out with its annual report on renewable energy progress in the world. And offshore wind in 2024, project activity was significantly down because of a lot of the headwinds, including inflation, project costs, supply chain squeezes, geopolitics, also populist, political pressure against renewables and offshore wind. So offshore wind did not have a good year in 2024, actually. So there are some clouds hanging over offshore wind globally, which do have implications for Scotland, I will say.
Yeah, and so just a question on the political elements of that. You mentioned the SNP earlier. How is the 2026 Scottish election influencing the domestic discussion around Scottish renewables?
I don't think it has had any influence yet because you don't really see anything. Nothing has come up on the hustings, as it were. It's perhaps slightly early days, but I think that because the SNP has made such a play for offshore wind, it may well become an issue. Um, I'm not sure when it will, but there's a chance that it might. Um, if you look at the speeches of First Minister John Swinney and his deputy Kate Forbes in the last year or so, you will see that offshore wind is mentioned quite a lot. It's, I would say, the single most important economic plank of the Scottish government's attempts to get growth going insofar as it can, given its devolved powers. And the government here in Scotland has committed up to £500 million in support of taxpayer money in support of developing the offshore wind supply chain. We're now about into year two of that 5 years, with about 170 million of that disbursed. So the lion's share of that 500 million that was budgeted for, I think, 1 or 2 years ago, is still to be dispersed. So it's a big ticket item for the Scottish government.
Yeah, and so you mentioned countries across the world looking to Scotland as a global leader in offshore wind. Why are international investors looking to Scotland, and who are the dominant actors within this?
Well, the reason they're looking is quite simple, because Scotland, as I said earlier, is in the forefront of developing offshore wind, particularly floating. And I mentioned earlier that 60% of Scotland is for floating offshore wind farms. And because this perhaps gets back to your question about what's the difference between floating and fixed, one might ask the question, why do we even want floating wind farms? What's that for? The answer is, the further out to sea that you can put a wind farm, the bigger it can be, not least because it doesn't have any visual implications. And the sweep of a blade, the bigger the sweep, the more efficiently it can gather wind, if you see what I mean, and the more power it can generate. And floating wind is very suitable for that, for putting really big turbines out there with massive sweep, generating lots of power. You can't do that quite so well with fixed because it's closer into shore. You certainly can't do it onshore because the turbines would be far too big and you'd have a real problem with that, not least with public objections to it, which you already actually do see with onshore wind. So Scotland is at the forefront of this, and there are plenty of other countries around the world. Brazil is another one. I should have mentioned Brazil, where they have vast swathes of ocean where they can put floating offshore wind turbines. And this is seen as the next frontier of offshore wind globally. And so all of these countries, because Scotland got there first, basically, or more or less first, China, I have to say, it did get there first. So it's very important not to forget China. We can maybe talk about China in a minute in relation to Scotland. Everybody wants to learn from Scotland, and they have been coming. The French have come, the Vietnamese I've just mentioned, the Japanese in particular. The Japanese are very interesting because they very early on saw Scotland as strategically important for their learnings in offshore wind, because they are not that advanced themselves. And they have made some very interesting strategic investments in Scotland as a way of doing and learning and taking it back to Japan. So, for example, I mentioned a wind farm in the ScotWind consortium called Ossian. One of the shareholders in that project is Marubeni, which is a very big Japanese conglomerate. One of the reasons they're in this is because they want to learn how to do a big floating offshore farm and then take those learnings back to Japan. Mitsui, which is another big conglomerate, has just bought the port of Nig in its entirety a few months ago. They want to also similarly learn how you put together the port infrastructure, that is needed to assemble the turbines, to send them on, get them on ships, to send them out to the wind farms to build them? How do you think about the steel, the manufacturing for the turbines, the whole ecosystem of how you make a floating offshore wind farm possible? The Japanese want to do it in Scotland, learn from it, and take it back to Japan. And I'm oversimplifying here, but it's basically what's happening. And then thirdly, there's another company called Sumitomo Electric,
Mhm.
which has invested £350 million in a subsea cable factory in Nig, which is where Mitsui just bought the port, by the way. And they're building this factory to make the necessary cables, the cables that you need to connect each wind farm to another one, and then the cables that take the power generator from them all on the seabed all the way to the land to your transmission system and then into the grid. Cables are absolutely critical to this whole thing. So the Japanese come here again, sort of to participate in the emergence of offshore wind and floating offshore wind in Scotland, and again to be part of that ecosystem and take the learnings back to Japan, and of course make money while they're at it.
And what about Europe? Are European companies in investing in Scottish wind?
Yes, they are. So if you think about the turbines, the things that vertical stick up, stick up, and then you've got the blades. Important not to confuse blades with turbines. A blade is the vertical steel tower, and then there are the blades that come off it. So Vestas is one of the turbine makers. They make blades as well. It's a Danish company, and they are planning to build a blade manufacturing factory at Portobello in Edinburgh. So they haven't signed off on this yet, but I think it's fairly imminent. So that would be a big investment, 100 million, 200 million pounds, perhaps. Siemens Gamesa, which is a German turbine manufacturer, which makes blades and turbines. They already have two factories in the UK. One is in Hull, and the other is the Isle of Wight. So they're already able to supply Scotland from there if the developers want to buy their kit, and some of them do. And then you have a third player, which is, we talked about China a minute ago. You have a third player called Mingyang Smart Energy, which is China's fourth largest offshore wind turbine manufacturer. This is relatively speaking, quite a young company. They started making offshore wind turbines as recently as 2006, but they are now massive. And they're by no means the only Chinese company that makes turbines. I said a minute ago, they're the fourth largest. There are other ones, including companies called Goldwind, which I think is perhaps the biggest. And these Chinese companies are on the march in Europe. Mingyang made an announcement a week ago exactly, that it plans to invest up to 1.5 billion pounds. That's not million, that's billion, in a blade factory in Scotland. Specifically, it would like to make these blades at the port of Ardersier, which is a vast 450-acre site, not far from Inverness, also not far from Nig, which I mentioned, which used to be a very, very big manufacturing site for oil and gas rigs and the oil and gas industry in the 70s and 80s. And then it was decommissioned many years ago. And it has been bought by an American private equity firm that has now spotted this opportunity in offshore wind, and they are busy turning it into a huge manufacturing and assembly site for offshore wind. Mm-hmm. And Mingyang wants to put its factory there. That is not a done deal because it has to be approved by the UK government, but it gives you an idea of the interest, the interest beyond European turbine manufacturers. China's a big player too.
Yeah, absolutely. And that brings us to some of the key challenges facing this sector. I think there's been a lot of debate as to the involvement of Chinese manufacturers in the UK's critical infrastructure. And that's not unique to wind energy. You've had Huawei in 5G networks. We had Jingye Steel at the Scunthorpe plant in April. And this is one more example of this. Why is Mingyang, I mean, 1.5 billion in investment is obviously a hugely attractive option, but what are the key drawbacks here?
Well, I would say let's deal quickly with the arguments in favor of having a Mingyang factory making blades in Scotland. They're fairly obvious, and they have to do with the jobs that could be created, the green jobs. It obviously means a big win for inward investment in the UK at a time when the Labour government is desperate for big wins in inward investment. It would also mean a big win for the Scottish government, which has been having talks with Mingyang for the last 2 years about this. Of course, with the elections coming, you can see that there will be competition between the Scottish government and the UK government to claim credit for this, just as an aside. The other benefit is that Mingyang is about 30% cheaper than Vestas and Siemens Gamesa. And so if you're one of the Scotwind developers and you're looking at the cost environment for offshore wind, which I alluded to earlier on, things are pretty tough for offshore wind right now. The economics are not good. And if you're you know putting your slide rule over the numbers and trying to make a decision as to whether you really will go ahead with the investments needed to build these offshore wind farms, which will only be, construction will only start in 2030, 2031, perhaps. These projects takes 10 years to build an offshore wind farm, roughly. It's a very long time. The economics of offshore wind are not where people thought they would be when they started the Scotwind leasing process in 2021, 2022. The world has changed, not least, because Putin invaded Ukraine in early 2022. Nobody saw that coming particularly. And I doubt very much anyone in the offshore wind developer community saw that coming. So the geopolitics of offshore wind is now very difficult, as well as the economics of it. So if you have the option of Chinese wind turbine manufacturer that's coming to you with terms that are 30% cheaper, and it's offering financing as well, which Mingyang does, then that's obviously going to be very attractive to the developers in Scotland to try and make their numbers work. So that's another attraction. And I think also, just generally speaking, it's very hard to make the case that you can ignore China, which is a green technology juggernaut, if you are serious about rolling out your renewable energy ambitions. And, you just have to look at what's happening with some of with solar panels, with Chinese electric vehicles. Here in Scotland, people will have noticed that BYD now has a number of dealerships and is selling cars on the streets. There's another one which I actually noticed only this morning. As I was on my morning walk, a car came past me. I thought, that looks rather nice. What's that? And I looked and it said Ora, O-R-A. And I had to look it up. And it's made by Great Wall Motors of China. I had not seen this car on the streets of Edinburgh until today. So that's just another sign of just how rapidly China is expanding in renewable technology in all sorts of ways. So you then, as I say, you have to sort of ask the question, can you really exclude China from your offshore wind supply chain? Set against that, however, are some pretty significant and I think very important negatives, which is why this is such a dilemma for the government. And I mean the British government, because it has jurisdiction with reserved powers over energy policy to decide whether this company should be allowed in to the supply chain. Apologies for my cat making a cameo appearance just behind me. The negatives are, number one, at a time when China is regarded by the UK government as a strategic challenge and threat to the UK in a number of ways. And you only have to read the Strategic Defence Review and other documents from the government, including going back to the Conservative government, to understand that and to join the dots on the geopolitics here. Is it wise to create such dependency on China by allowing Chinese wind turbine manufacturer such a significant presence in your offshore wind supply chain. What would happen if we got into a seriously adversarial situation with China and we had to somehow unpick that dependency? This would be very hard indeed. And so this question of dependency looms large over the decision, like a decision like this. And the second thing has to do with security, which links to critical national energy infrastructure security. And it relates to the software, the operational software, which is embedded in a turbine, and the digital technology that's embedded in a turbine. In the turbine, you have this operational software which dictates how it operates, how it's controlled, and how it's maintained. And that software is developed by the turbine manufacturer. It's their proprietary algorithms in there. Nobody else can see it. Nobody else has visibility into it. And that operational software remains in the control of the manufacturer, even after the turbine's been sold to a developer. So if you're a developer and you've said, right, thank you very much, we'll take 50 Mingyang turbines, you don't control those turbines completely. You do control the daily operations and maintenance, and you probably contract that out to somebody. So you have some control. But if push comes to shove, and again, we're living in a world where China has exerted economic coercion before. Lithuania is a good example of this, where a couple of years ago, Lithuania found all of its exports halted to China because China deleted all the Lithuanian export data from its systems after Lithuania, I think, decided to entertain the possibility of opening a Taipei representative office in Vilnius. China immediately pulled the lever of economic coercion to punish Lithuania. So people who think that this is far-fetched are, I would say, rather naive, geopolitically naive. It's not completely far-fetched to suggest that having the ability to switch off turbines remotely by instructing Mingyang, and by the way, it would be the Communist Party in Beijing that would do the instructing, and Mingyang would have to obey. It would have no choice, even though it is a privately held company, and that doesn't matter. In an extreme scenario, you could imagine a scenario where something unpleasant could happen to those wind farms, and it's not so much the wind farms themselves, but it's the downstream damage to the transmission system that would be caused, and even the grid. So this is quite serious. Now, there are people who say, well, this is ridiculous. We have Chinese chips in our mobile phones. We have them in the electric cars that we drive. I would say to people who make that argument, that is not an apples to apples comparison. You're talking an order of magnitude more serious when you're talking about your critical national energy infrastructure, especially when it comes to transmission and grid. So that's the security argument. And I think that this has gone right up to the level of the British security services, and they've been looking at this for a number of months to decide, the pros and cons of allowing Mingyang in on this basis. I think that the Chinese would say this is overblown. And there's a phrase that the official Chinese spokespeople often use in scenarios like this, where they accuse Western governments of having a, quote, Cold War mentality, unquote, in their reactions and assessments of these kinds of things. I'll just put that out there because I think it's fair to say what I think the Chinese side would say. But it is a very live discussion at the level of the UK government now. And I think what I think is interesting about this Mingyang announcement, which we literally had a week ago, is that Mingyang had said nothing about its plans publicly since 2021, when it signed an MOU with the then Conservative government, which envisaged the potential of a factory in the UK to be a beachhead for Europe. Mingyang didn't say anything in the intervening 4 years, actually. They started discussions with the Scottish government and Scottish Enterprise and Highlands and Islands Council and the developers. They talked to the developers about whether they would like to use their kit about 2 years ago. But they still hadn't said anything publicly until a week ago. Now, the timing of their announcement, I think, is very interesting because the UK government has also been silent so far this year on whether it would allow Mingyang into the UK supply chain and whether it would allow Mingyang to build a factory in Scotland. We had thought that there would be something decided by spring this year, but because President Trump was coming to Scotland, and because President Trump hates windmills and China in equal measure, I think the UK government decided that it would hold its counsel, keep its counsel, and not say anything and not make a decision on this, just to get Trump's private visit to Aberdeenshire to open his golf course out of the way, and B, to get the state visit by Trump, which happened a month ago, out of the way as well. We're now at a point where everybody's expecting the UK government finally to get off the fence and decide yes or no. And this is where Mingyang's announcement comes in, because they thought, right, it's time to go over the heads of the government and make a public announcement and demonstrate how much money we're going to invest in Scotland and in Britain, how many jobs are going to be created, how we're going to help Britain become a clean energy superpower. And if you read the press release they put out, they laid it on pretty thick, actually. If you read it, it's pretty seductive commercially. I mean, you can't, it's very hard to say no to this. But quite clearly, it's been designed as I would say, quite a tactically clever ploy to put pressure on the UK government to finally come off the fence and say, all right, then, in you come. And so as we record this podcast, we are at a very interesting moment in time on this.
And so, in terms of an alternative potential solution to this, if Scotland can continue to attract global investment, can that from companies in Singapore, Japan, Europe, do they have the potential to ameliorate these security concerns whilst providing the investment that Scottish offshore winds or the offshore wind sector needs to survive, or is this something that they simply don't have the capacity to do in the way that Chinese investors like Mingyang can do?
Well, I think when we ask that question, we have to narrow it down to the two companies in Europe that I mentioned earlier on that are relevant for what Mingyang does, and ask the question, is there anyone else other than Mingyang who can do this? And by this, what we really mean is floating offshore wind turbines. Remember, I've said maybe twice now, ScotWind is 60% floating offshore wind. At the moment, Mingyang is the only company in contention that can produce floating offshore wind turbines at scale that would be needed by the developers to make their ScotWind plans viable. To put it even more starkly, and actually somebody at Mingyang said this to me last week, without us, ScotWind cannot go ahead. It's quite stark, actually. And so somebody listening to this might say, well, what about Vestas and Siemens Gamesa? Don't they make offshore wind turbines as well? The answer is a bit, but nowhere near on the scale of Mingyang. And by the way, they are too busy fulfilling their existing pipeline of orders for fixed bottom turbines. And they've had a pretty rough time of it financially, these two companies, of late. So they are in no position to invest heavily in floating offshore wind turbine technology. So it's quite tough. This makes the dilemma as to whether you allow Mingyang in even more acute, because it then becomes a question of, well, if we don't allow them in, what does that mean for the future of ScotWind, and therefore also the future of the UK's ambition in offshore wind? So it is a hideous dilemma for the UK government, I have to say.
Yeah, and so to conclude then, given the kind of the crossroads that the sector sits in at the moment, what are the key developments to watch here? Are you optimistic about the trajectory of Scottish offshore wind?
Um, I am realistic, I think. I mean, offshore wind, just to give you the numbers, I mentioned the International Renewable Energy Association at the beginning of our conversation. You know, growth in offshore wind, this is globally, capacity deployment slowed by 26% in 2024 compared with the 2023 level. That's quite a drop. Just to put that in gigawatts for the people who live and breathe gigawatts, it was 11.6 gigawatts was deployed in offshore wind globally in 2023. It was only 8.6 last year. That's the 26% decline. Things are not looking that great in offshore wind at the moment. Now, this is why some of the ScotWind developers are now, I think, rethinking some of their plans. But it's also why, getting back to the dilemma I mentioned a minute ago about Mingyang, it makes it even more attractive for them to look at Mingyang because they're thinking, well, our projects are really challenged in all sorts of ways, but the one thing we can do to make them work is use Mingyang. If we really want to make this work. And so we're at this intensely delicate moment of economic choice for the developers, and it's an intensely delicate moment, I think, for Scottish offshore wind. I mean, Mingyang is not the only factor, of course, in the mix here. You have the fact that you need to rapidly develop Scotland's port infrastructure to handle the rollout of offshore wind, because wind turbines and blades have to be laid out on vast amounts of space on the quayside of a port and partly assembled and so forth before they're then put on ships to be taken out to the wind where they're supposed to be deployed for final installment. That's a huge piece of this. That needs to be ramped up quickly. A lot needs to be done. And then, of course, I haven't mentioned the grid. I mean, there's not much point building a wind farm if you can't plug the electricity into a functioning grid that can take all this power. And the fact of the matter is the grid in the UK is not yet fit for purpose to take all this. And, grid upgrades are happening. Scottish Power is investing billions in this, for example. But this will take time. And again, so if you're a developer looking at this, you have to balance, well, will the grid be ready in time for me to make this investment commitment to move to the next step? With my wind farm, it's a sort of a chicken and egg thing at the moment. And so I would say we're at a moment potentially of a potential shakeout where there are some developers that will simply throw in the towel and decide that they can't make the numbers work when they thought they could, or as soon as they might, and they will give up. And they will either pull out or they will sell the stakes that they have in their wind farms to other people. That, by the way, is already happening. But the question is, are there any willing buyers for such assets at a time when the global picture for offshore wind is not great? And of course, has been, made even less great by Trump banning offshore wind in America. So I would say I'm realistic, neither pessimistic nor optimistic, which is very helpful.
Well, on that note, I think that's our time for today. So thank you very much for speaking to us today, Jeremy. If our listeners would like to read more of Jeremy's work, you'll be able to find links to his articles in the podcast description. Thank you for listening, and see you next time.